Mason Holbrook, 43 years old, lay dying under the merciless Arizona sun, his cracked lips caked with dried blood, his tongue swollen against his teeth. 3 days without proper food, 2 without water. The vast desert stretched endlessly around him, indifferent to his suffering. Heat shimmered along the horizon, washing the sky white and carrying nothing but dust across rocks and sand. His fingers clutched a silver pocket watch, worn smooth by 4 generations of Holbrook men. The family heirloom felt heavy in his palm, its weight a final anchor to this world, as darkness gathered at the edges of his vision. The timepiece had stopped ticking hours ago. Or was it days? Time had lost all meaning in this wasteland. For the first time in 5 years, Mason's lips formed a prayer. "Lord, if you're still there," he whispered, his voice a rasp in the silence. The words felt foreign on his tongue, like a language half forgotten. Once, prayer had flowed from him freely as water from a spring. But that was before St. Louis, before the fever took Margaret and little Thomas, before he watched his family lowered into the ground while a colleague recited empty words of comfort. The sun beat down, relentless. Mason's legs had given out an hour earlier, sending him crashing into the burning sand. His cheek pressed against the grit, eyes fixed on the pocket watch clutched in his trembling hand. He'd promised himself he wouldn't stop, that he would keep moving until he found shade or water or anything at all. But his body had betrayed him, and now the desert would claim him as it had claimed countless others. A shadow fell across his face. At first, Mason thought it was a hallucination. He'd seen shapes before in the heat, mirages of water, trees, even people who weren't there. But this shadow remained, and slowly it bent closer. Mason's vision blurred, then refocused. A woman's face appeared above him, bronze skin catching the harsh light, long black hair braided with leather strips and adorned with feathers that stirred in the dry wind. Her dress was deerskin, decorated with faded beadwork and cut low at the neckline, showing more of her curves than perhaps proper society would approve. The fabric was torn in places, uneven at the edges, showing signs of hardware. Yet there was dignity in her posture, pride in the set of her jaw. She looked at him with sharp, dark eyes that held both suspicion and something else. Hesitation, as though deciding whether he was worth saving. Her gaze moved to the pocket watch in his hand, lingered there a moment, then returned to his face. Without a word, she drew out a small water skin and tipped it toward his mouth. The water touched his lips, and Mason swallowed greedily, though most of it spilled down his chin into the sand. Still, it was enough to pierce through the fog of dehydration. His chest heaved, and his eyes filled with unexpected tears at the relief. "Thank you," he croaked, the words scraping his throat. Her expression remained unchanged. She pulled the water skin back and studied him in silence, weighing the choice. Leave him or help him. Mason recognized that calculating look. He had seen it on the faces of men deciding whether to carry a wounded comrade or let him die. This woman was no stranger to hard decisions. Finally, she gestured for him to rise. Mason pressed his palms into the dirt, groaning as he forced himself onto his knees. His arms shook with the effort, but somehow he got to his feet. She turned and began walking, her steps quick and sure across the uneven ground. She didn't look back to see if he followed, as if she had already decided he would either come or perish. Mason stumbled after her, his legs barely supporting his weight, the ground seeming to tilt beneath him. They walked until they reached a shallow hollow carved into red rock formations. It offered a strip of shade and broke the wind that had begun to stir the desert sand. She moved into the hollow and lowered her meager possessions, the water skin, strips of dried meat wrapped in cloth, a blanket, a thin shawl. Mason collapsed against the cool rock, his chest heaving, sweat cooling on his skin in the blessed sliver of shade. The woman sat across from him, pulling the shawl over her shoulders, though the heat still clung to the air. Her eyes occasionally flicked toward him, but she remained silent. The quiet stretched between them, heavy but not hostile. Mason studied her through the haze of exhaustion. He guessed her to be around 28, maybe 30. In his 43 years, Mason had seen his share of hardship, but the dignity in this woman's bearing was something different. Her features were distinctly Apache, high cheekbones, strong nose, eyes dark and watchful. But there was something different about her carriage, the way she sat, the occasional movement of her hands. She seemed caught between worlds. He wanted to ask her name, to thank her properly for saving his life, but his throat ached too much. Instead, after a long pause, he said quietly, Mason Holbrook. Her gaze met his briefly, unreadable, then drifted away again. She did not offer her name in return. Mason leaned back against the rock, closing his eyes. The heirloom timepiece rested in his palm, its tarnished case reflecting a brief glint of sunlight onto the stone wall. For a moment, the dancing light reminded him of church windows from his former life, shafts of illumination piercing sacred darkness. The woman's eyes tracked the gleam, a flicker of curiosity crossing her face. Water, she said finally, her English clear and without the heavy accent Mason might have expected. Drink slowly. She passed him the water skin again. This time he sipped carefully, letting the precious liquid soothe his parched throat. You would have died, she stated matter of fact. Another hour. Mason nodded weakly. Why did you save me? His voice was rough, barely audible. She didn't answer immediately, instead reached for the small bundle of dried meat. She tore off a piece and offered it to him. Mason took it with shaking fingers, knowing he should eat even though his stomach cramped at the thought. You have a name? He tried again after chewing the tough, salty meat. A long pause stretched between them. Then, Ravenwing. Another pause. Some call me Sarah. The dual name confirmed what Mason had suspected. She had spent time among white settlers, perhaps at one of the missionary schools established for native children. It explained her command of English in certain mannerisms that seemed at odds with her traditional dress. Ravenwing, he repeated, respecting her choice to offer her tribal name first. I'm grateful. She acknowledged this with a slight inclination of her head. Her eyes dropped to the pocket watch he still clutched, curiosity evident in her gaze. Mason instinctively closed his fingers tighter around it, a protective gesture he couldn't help. The timepiece was more than a family heirloom. It was all he had left of his past life, his family, the man he used to be. It was my father's, he offered, not opening his hand, and his father's before him. Ravenwing nodded once as if this explained something important about him. Perhaps it did. As the day wore on, the hollow grew marginally cooler. Mason drifted in and out of consciousness, his body still fighting the effects of dehydration and exposure. Each time he opened his eyes, he found Ravenwing there, sometimes mending tears in her dress with bone needles, sometimes simply watching the desert beyond their shelter. When the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the sand, Ravenwing gathered a small amount of dry brush and built a fire near the hollow's entrance. The flames were small, just enough to ward off the chill that descended swiftly in the desert night. In the flickering firelight, Mason studied her more carefully. There was a sorrow in her bearing that matched something deep within himself. He wondered what had brought her to this place, alone in the vast emptiness, with nothing but a few possessions to her name. You're far from your people, he observed, his voice stronger after hours of rest and small sips of water. Ravenwing's eyes met his across the fire. As are you. The simple response carried weight. Mason felt a surprising connection in that moment. Two souls adrift, separated from the anchors that had once defined them. Night fell completely, transforming the desert into a cathedral of stars. The Milky Way stretched across the black sky, brilliant in a way Mason had almost forgotten. In the east, he could make out the constellation Aquila, the eagle, spreading its celestial wings. Ravenwing followed his gaze upward. The stars are spirits, she said softly. Our ancestors watch from above. My wife used to say they were windows into heaven, Mason replied, the words escaping before he could stop them. It was the first time he'd spoken of Margaret aloud in 2 summers. Ravenwing's expression softened slightly. You lost her. It wasn't a question. Mason nodded, his throat tight. Fever, 5 years ago. My son, too. The fire crackled between them, sending sparks upward to join the stars. Ravenwing began to hum, a low melody that rose and fell like the desert wind. The sound stirred something in Mason's memory, not the hymns of his past, but something older, more primal. He closed his eyes, letting the song wash over him. For the first time in years, he felt the knot of grief in his chest loosen slightly, allowing him to breathe more freely. Your voice, Wayne, he said when she finished. It's beautiful. It is not for beauty, she replied. It is for the spirits, to guide them home. Mason understood then that she was singing not just for herself, but for him as well, for the losses they both carried. As the night deepened, the desert turned bitter cold. The hollow held little warmth despite the small fire. Mason shivered under his thin shirt, the sweat from the day now chilling his skin. Ravenwing noticed his discomfort. After a moment's hesitation, she moved closer, extending half of her blanket toward him. Mason paused, then shifted nearer, allowing the blanket to cover them both. Their shoulders touched lightly, the contact awkward at first, but necessary for survival. Sleep, she said. Tomorrow we find more water. Mason wanted to ask more questions. Where she planned to go, why she had chosen to help him, what dangers might be waiting beyond their small sanctuary. But exhaustion pulled at him, dragging his consciousness downward into darkness. His last thought before sleep claimed him was of the silver pocket watch still clutched in his hand and the inscription inside that he had not read in years. Faith guides through darkness. Faith, a word that had once defined his existence and now felt as distant as the stars above. Mason dreamed of St. Louis. The air hung thick with humidity and the smell of sickness. Sheets stained with sweat. Margaret's hand, burning with fever, clutching his as he prayed by her bedside. Little Thomas's shallow breathing growing fainter with each passing hour. The doctor's grim expression. The terrible silence that followed. Then the dream shifted. He was no longer in St. Louis, but in a military camp on the frontier. Blue uniforms. The smell of gunpowder and leather. Men gathered around campfires, cleaning rifles, sharpening knives. A young lieutenant with eager eyes approaching him. Chaplain Holbrook, the men need your guidance before tomorrow's operation. Lieutenant Frank Ryder, barely 25, newly commissioned and hungry to prove himself. His face eager in the firelight, his uniform still crisp despite weeks in the field. The dream blurred again. Gunfire, smoke, the chaos of battle. Apache warriors fighting with desperate courage to protect their land. Mason moving through the carnage, unarmed except for his faith, tending to wounded soldiers. Lieutenant Ryder shouting orders, his voice cracking with strain. A warrior appearing suddenly before Mason, knife raised, face painted for war. A brief struggle, pain searing across Mason's neck. The warrior falling backward, clutching a wound in his chest, his eyes wide with surprise. A silver emblem glinting on the warrior's knife handle, a crescent moon. Chaplain! Chaplain! Help me! Ryder's voice panicked, coming from somewhere in the smoke. Mason looking around desperately, unable to locate the young officer. Then another explosion. Bodies thrown like ragdolls. Mason knocked unconscious by the blast. When he awoke in the field hospital hours later, they told him Ryder was missing, presumed dead. The Apache village had been destroyed. The mission successful, despite the losses. No! Mason bolted upright, the cry escaping his lips before he was fully awake. His hand flew to his neck, fingers finding the crescent-shaped scar hidden beneath his beard. Heart hammering, he looked around wildly, momentarily disoriented. The hollow, the desert, dawn light spilling over the eastern horizon. Ravenwing watching him with those piercing dark eyes, her expression unreadable. Bad dreams, she observed. Mason wiped cold sweat from his brow, willing his pulse to slow. Old memories, he corrected, his voice rough with sleep and emotion. You spoke of battle, she said, stirring the embers of their small fire, and called a name. Frank. Mason froze. Had he spoken aloud in his sleep? Revealed things he'd spent years trying to bury? I don't recall, he lied, avoiding her gaze. Ravenwing didn't press, but her eyes remained watchful, calculating. She handed him the water skin. Drink, we go to the spring today. Mason accepted gratefully, both for the water and the change of subject. As he drank, the pocket watch slipped from the folds of his clothing where he had secured it during the night. It fell to the ground between them, the silver case popping open to reveal its face and the small daguerreotype secured inside the lid. Ravenwing's eyes fell upon the image, a woman with gentle eyes and a small boy on her lap, both dressed in the fashion of a decade earlier. Before Mason could snatch it back, She noted the inscription engraved in the inner case. Faith guides through darkness. Your family, she said as Mason hurriedly closed the watch and returned it to his pocket. Yes. The word came out harsher than he intended. Ravenwing nodded slowly. The fever took mine as well. My mother. Long ago. She rose and began gathering her few belongings. The spring is bathed. Can you walk? Mason tested his legs, finding them shaky but functional. The brief rest, water, and food had restored some of his strength. I'll manage. They set out as the sun climbed higher, Ravenwing leading the way with sure steps across the rocky terrain. Mason followed, his body aching but driven by the promise of water. His mind kept returning to the dream, to the memories it had stirred. He had not always been a drifting cowhand. Once he had been Chaplain Mason Holbrook of the 7th Cavalry, a man of God bringing spiritual comfort to soldiers on the frontier. He had believed in his mission then, in the righteousness of expanding civilization westward, until St. Louis, until the fever took everything he loved and his prayers went unanswered. After burying his family, Mason had turned his back on his calling. He removed his clerical collar, packed away his Bible, and headed west. For 5 years, he had drifted from ranch to ranch, trail to trail, taking work where he could find it, drinking when the silence grew too heavy, avoiding any reminder of the faith he had abandoned. Only the pocket watch remained, impossible to part with despite the memories it carried. The terrain grew more rugged as they walked, rocky outcroppings rising from the desert floor like the spines of ancient creatures. Ravenwing moved with the grace of one who knew this land intimately, occasionally pausing to let Mason catch up when his strength flagged. There, she said finally, pointing to a narrow arroyo cutting between two large formations. The spring is hidden there? Mason followed her down into the shallow ravine, relief washing through him at the sight of clear water seeping from a crack in the stone wall. It wasn't much, a small pool that gathered below the seep, but it was life in the midst of desolation. He fell to his knees beside the pool, cupping the cool liquid in his hands and drinking deeply. Ravenwing filled her water skin, her movements efficient and practiced. When she finished, she stepped back, allowing Mason space. The Apache know this place? He asked between drinks. Some, she replied. Not many come this far. Too dangerous. Dangerous how? Blue coats, settlers, bandits. She shrugged. We'll want Apache dead. The matter-of-fact way she spoke sent a chill through Mason despite the growing heat of the day. He had seen firsthand the violence between settlers and native tribes, had tried to minister to both sides even as the conflicts grew bloodier. And then he had walked away from it all, unable to reconcile the God he served with the suffering he witnessed. You're alone out here, he observed, watching her gather something from a nearby cactus. Wait now. Ravenwing's movements paused briefly. My people cast me out, she said, her voice carefully neutral, after my husband died. Why would they do that? Mason asked, genuinely confused. She turned to face him, her expression hardening. They say I brought death to our village, that I betrayed our ways. Mason waited, sensing there was more to the story. Ravenwing seemed to debate whether to continue, then made a decision. I helped a wounded soldier, she said finally, a white man who spoke kindly. I showed him our ways, taught him our words. Her eyes grew distant. He promised peace. Instead, he brought death. A cold feeling settled in Mason's stomach. This soldier, what was his name? Lieutenant Frank Ryder. The name hit Mason like a physical blow. Frank Ryder, the same man from his dreams, from his past. The young officer he had mentored, whose loss had haunted him for years. You knew him, Ravenwing said, her eyes sharp on his face. It wasn't a question. Mason swallowed hard. I served with the army, yes, as a chaplain. A holy man? Surprise flickered across her features. Once, Mason admitted, the word bitter on his tongue. Not anymore. Ravenwing studied him with new intensity, as if seeing him for the first time. Her gaze dropped to his neck, where the crescent scar lay hidden beneath his beard. A chaplain who carries a gun, she observed, nodding toward the revolver at his hip. Who fights in battle? I never fired in combat, Mason said truthfully. The gun came later, when I left the service. He didn't mention the Apache warrior he had killed in self-defense, the one who had given him the scar on his neck. the one whose knife had borne a crescent moon emblem. Ravenwing seemed to accept this, though suspicion lingered in her gaze. Why did you leave your calling, holy man? The question struck deeper than she could know. Mason looked away, focusing on the small pool of water. God and I came to a disagreement, he said finally, when my wife and son died of fever in St. Louis. You prayed, but they died anyway, Ravenwing surmised. Mason nodded, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in his throat. My people say the Creator does not give us what we want, she said, only what we need to become stronger. What I needed was my family, Mason replied, an edge of bitterness creeping into his voice. Perhaps what you needed was to find a new purpose, she countered. As I did. Mason looked up at her, struck by her insight. And what purpose did you find after losing everything? Ravenwing's eyes met his steadily. To survive. To remember. To keep the old ways alive, even alone. And they fell silent as the sun climbed higher in the sky, beating down on the desert with increasing intensity. Mason scooped out more water onto his face and neck, the coolness a blessed relief. When he pushed back his collar to wet the skin there, Ravenwing's gaze fixed on his neck. The scar, she said, her voice suddenly tight. How did you get it? Mason's hand instinctively went to his neck, covering the crescent mark. Horse kicked me years back, he lied. Nearly took my head off. Ravenwing's expression remained carefully blank, but something had changed in her posture. A new tension had entered her body. We should not stay here, she said abruptly. Others may come. Before Mason could respond, she was already moving up the arroyo toward the open desert. He hurried after her, confused by the sudden shift. They spent the day in the meager shade of a rock overhang not far from the spring. Ravenwing taught Mason how to identify desert plants that stored water, which roots were edible, how to set simple traps for small game. Her knowledge was impressive, born of necessity and tradition. As the day wore on, Mason found his strength returning. The water had revived him, and the small amounts of food Ravenwing shared were enough to keep his body functioning. By the time evening approached, he was able to help gather brush for their fire, though his movements remained slower than hers. When darkness fell again, they sat beside a small fire, the stars once more creating a brilliant canopy above them. Mason felt the weight of unasked questions between them, growing heavier with each passing hour. Why did you help me? He finally asked. You could have left me to die. Ravenwing stared into the flames for a long moment. Your eyes, she said at last. They carried the same pain as my father's. Your father? Half Mexican, half white, a translator for the missionaries. Her voice softened with memory. He loved my mother deeply, taught me to read the white man's books. The tribe accepted him because he respected our ways, even as he brought new knowledge. What happened to him? Soldiers killed him during a raid, she said simply. They did not care that he tried to speak for peace. Mason felt shame wash through him. How many times had he given comfort to soldiers who participated in such raids? How many prayers had he offered for missions that resulted in bloodshed? I'm sorry, he said, knowing the words were inadequate. Ravenwing nodded slightly, accepting his sentiment without comment. After a pause, she spoke again. When I found you, I saw a man lost not just in the desert, but in his spirit. She met his gaze across the fire, like my father in his final days. The observation struck uncomfortably close to the truth. Mason had indeed been lost, wandering without purpose since the day he buried his family and turned his back on his faith. Your watch, she continued, it speaks of faith, yet you hide it away. You carry it, but do not look at it. Mason's hand went to his pocket, feeling the solid weight of the timepiece. Some things are too painful to look at, he admitted. Too many memories. Memories keep the dead alive, Ravenwing countered. My people honor our ancestors by remembering them, by speaking their names, by singing their songs. As if to demonstrate, she began to sing softly, the same haunting melody from the night before. The notes rose and fell in the still desert air, carrying emotions Mason couldn't name but felt deeply in his chest. When she finished, the silence seemed more profound, almost sacred. Mason found himself reaching for his pocket, drawing out the silver watch. His thumb traced over the worn case, feeling the small dent where Thomas had once dropped it as a toddler. Slowly, deliberately, he opened the case. Margaret's face looked up at him from the small photograph, little Thomas on her lap, both smiling, unaware of the fate that awaited them. The inscription gleamed in the firelight, "Faith guides through darkness." "My grandfather had this made when he became a minister," Mason said softly. "Passed it to my father, who passed it to me when I followed in their footsteps." "3 generations of holy men," Ravenwing observed. "Yes, until me." Mason closed the watch again, the snap of the case loud in the quiet night. "I was supposed to pass it to Thomas one day." Ravenwing studied him across the flames. "The path does not always go where we expect." "No," Mason agreed. "It certainly doesn't." The fire crackled between them, sending sparks upward toward the vast, star-filled sky. For the first time in years, Mason felt a stirring of something like peace. Not happiness, not contentment, but a momentary respite from the anger and grief that had driven him since St. Louis. As the night grew colder, they moved closer to the fire. Ravenwing again shared her blanket, the arrangement less awkward than before. Their shoulders touched, sharing warmth necessary for survival in the desert night. Mason lay awake long after Ravenwing had drifted to sleep, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead. His thoughts turned to his abandoned Bible, packed away at the bottom of his saddlebag, lost now with his horse. Once those pages had contained all the answers he needed. Now they seemed as distant and unreachable as the stars above. Yet something had shifted within him, some small crack in the wall he had built around his heart. Perhaps it was gratitude for being saved, or the simple human connection after years of isolation. Perhaps it was Ravenwing's quiet strength, her ability to endure despite losing everything. As sleep finally claimed him, Mason's hand closed once more around the silver pocket watch. For the first time in 5 years, he did not dream of fever or battle or loss. Instead, he dreamed of stars, countless points of light guiding travelers through darkness. Dawn broke with a distant sound that instantly brought Mason to full alertness. Hoofbeats, multiple horses moving across the desert floor. He sat up quickly, hand going to his revolver. Beside him, Ravenwing was already alert, her body tense as she listened. "Riders," she whispered, unnecessarily. Mason nodded, moving to the edge of their shelter to peer across the open terrain. In the distance, he could make out a group of horsemen, 5 or 6, moving steadily in their direction. "Army," he wondered aloud, trying to make out uniforms in the early light. Ravenwing shook her head. "Bounty hunters." The word sent a chill through Mason. Bounty hunters? Looking for what? Her eyes met his, hard with fear and determination. "For me." Before Mason could ask more, she was gathering her few possessions with swift, practiced movements. "We must go, now." "Why would bounty hunters be after you?" Mason pressed, even as he helped stamp out their fire and scatter the evidence of their camp. "For being Apache," she said bitterly, "for helping the soldier who betrayed us. The army posted rewards for any Apache who helped Ryder." "That's madness," Mason objected. "You weren't responsible for—" "They do not care," she cut him off. $500 for the Indian woman who guided Lieutenant Ryder." Mason felt sick. He had seen such bounties before, supposedly for hostile Indians, but in practice an excuse for the worst kind of men to hunt human beings for profit. "How long have they been after you?" "2 summers," she replied, slinging her small pack over her shoulder. "Come, there is another place we can hide." They moved swiftly away from their shelter, keeping low and using the terrain for cover. Mason's legs were stronger now, and despite the lingering weakness in his body, adrenaline kept him moving steadily alongside Ravenwing. They had covered perhaps half a mile when the sound of gunfire cracked across the desert. A warning shot fired into the air. The hunters had found their abandoned camp. "This way," Ravenwing urged, pulling Mason toward a narrow ravine cutting through the rocky landscape. They scrambled down into the relative safety of the steep-walled passage, moving quickly through shadow while the sun illuminated the desert above them. The ravine twisted and turned, eventually opening into a broader canyon dotted with sparse vegetation. Mason realized they were moving north, away from the direction he had been traveling before his horse died. "There's an old cavalry outpost," he said between breaths as they hurried along. "About a day's journey north. Abandoned after the Apache campaigns. Might offer better shelter than these rocks." Ravenwing shot him a sharp look. "An army place?" Empty now, Mason assured her. I passed it 2 years back. While driving cattle, solid stone walls, well hidden in the foothills. She considered this, clearly weighing the risk of approaching any military structure against the protection it might offer. Finally, she gave a short nod. We will see by him, she said, which wasn't quite agreement, but wasn't refusal either. They moved throughout the morning, keeping to low ground and natural cover whenever possible. By midday, the heat had become oppressive again, forcing them to stop in the shade of a large boulder. Their water was running low, but Ravenwing found a barrel cactus and demonstrated how to cut it open for the moisture inside. As they rested, Mason's thoughts returned to the bounty hunters. How did they find you out here? It's miles from anywhere. They never stopped looking, Ravenwing said, her voice weary. And there are signs for those who know how to read them. Smoke from fire, footprints near water. Mason nodded, understanding. Men who hunted for a living developed keen senses for disruptions in the natural order. A crushed plant, a scuffed stone, minute details that told stories to those who could interpret them. We should keep moving, he said after they had rested briefly. If we can reach the foothills by nightfall, we'll have better cover. They continued north, the terrain gradually changing from flat desert to rolling hills dotted with juniper and pinyon pine. The added vegetation provided better concealment, but also made it harder to spot pursuers. Mason found himself constantly scanning their back trail, hand resting on the butt of his revolver. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Ravenwing suddenly froze, raising a hand for silence. Mason stopped instantly, straining his ears. Voices. Distant but clear enough to make out words carried on the desert air. Tracks lead this way. Fresh ones. How many you figure? 2 sets, one smaller. That'll be the squaw. Other could be her buck or some white renegade. Mason's jaw tightened at the casual bigotry. Ravenwing's expression remained impassive, but her eyes burned with a cold anger. Keep low, she whispered, gesturing toward a dense thicket of juniper ahead. We wait until dark. They crept forward, using the lengthening shadows for cover, and concealed themselves within the fragrant boughs of the juniper. Through small gaps in the foliage, Mason could just make out the riders as they crested a rise about a quarter-mile back. 5 men on horseback, rifles slung across their saddles, dust clinging to their trail-worn clothing. One of them, slightly ahead of the others, caught Mason's attention. Something about the set of his shoulders, the way he sat his horse. No, he whispered, disbelief coursing through him. Ravenwing glanced at him sharply. What? Mason squinted, trying to get a better look at the lead rider's face. It was difficult at this distance, but there was something hauntingly familiar about him. The man turned in his saddle, scanning the terrain ahead, and Mason caught a glimpse of his profile and the distinctive scar that ran from temple to jaw. It can't be, he breathed. But it was. Lieutenant Frank Ryder, the man Mason had believed dead for 2 years, was very much alive and leading a group of bounty hunters straight toward them. The sight of Frank Ryder, a man Mason had long believed dead, left him frozen in disbelief. There was no mistaking that scar, that posture, that commanding presence that had once inspired young soldiers on the frontier. You know him, Ravenwing whispered, studying Mason's shocked expression. Mason swallowed hard, unable to tear his eyes away from the approaching riders. Lieutenant Ryder, he confirmed, his voice barely audible. My God, he survived. Something flickered in Ravenwing's eyes, recognition, understanding, and a sudden, sharp suspicion. You were there, she said, the words more accusation than question. At the raid on our village. Mason couldn't lie, not with the evidence of his past riding toward them. I was the regiment's chaplain, he admitted. I tended the wounded, carried no weapon. But yes, I was there. Her body tensed, and for a moment Mason thought she might flee, or worse, attack him. But then the sounds of the approaching riders drew closer, and survival instinct overrode all else. Later, she hissed. We talk later. They pressed deeper into the juniper thicket, making themselves as small and still as possible. Mason's heart hammered against his ribs, a deafening drum he feared might give them away. His mind raced with questions. How had Ryder survived? Why was he hunting Ravenwing? What connection did he have to the man Mason had once known? The riders drew closer, their horses' hooves sending small clouds of dust into the air. Through the branches, Mason could see Ryder's face more clearly now. Harder than he remembered. Weathered by sun and wind, the scar along his jaw puckered and angry. His eyes, once bright with youthful ambition, now held a cold calculation that sent a chill down Mason's spine. "Track split here," one of the men called out, dismounting to examine the ground. "Some heading north, others west." Ryder pulled his horse to a halt just 30 yards from their hiding place. "She's clever," he said, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "Too clever to head west. There's nothing that way but open desert." He scanned the terrain, his gaze passing over their hiding spot without pausing. Mason held his breath, feeling Ravenwing grow impossibly still beside him. "North," Ryder decided. "Toward the foothills, more cover, more water." He adjusted his hat, shielding his eyes from the setting sun. "We'll make camp at the old crossing. Pick up the trail at first light." The hunters moved on, continuing north at an unhurried pace. Only when the sound of hoofbeats had faded completely did Mason release the breath he'd been holding. "They're heading for the same area as the outpost," he whispered. "But we can circle around, approach from the east." Ravenwing nodded, her expression unreadable in the deepening shadows. They remained hidden until twilight, then emerged cautiously from the thicket. "You're Lieutenant Ryder," she said as they began moving east, keeping low among the scattered vegetation. "You thought him dead." "After the raid," Mason confirmed. "There was an explosion. Many were killed or wounded. Ryder was reported missing." He shook his head, still processing the shock. "I searched for him myself but found nothing. Everyone assumed he'd been killed." "He lived," Ravenwing said flatly, "and became worse than before." They walked in tense silence as darkness settled fully over the land. The stars emerged, brilliant and cold, offering just enough light to navigate by. Mason's thoughts churned with this new revelation. What had happened to transform the idealistic young officer he had known into a ruthless bounty hunter? And why was he so determined to find Ravenwing? "You said you helped him," Mason ventured after they had covered nearly a mile. "Before the raid." Ravenwing's steps didn't falter, but her shoulders stiffened. "He was wounded, separated from his patrol. I found him near death." "Why help him?" It wasn't an accusation, merely curiosity. She was quiet for so long that Mason thought she might not answer. When she did, her voice was soft with old pain. "My father taught me that all life has value, that we must see beyond tribe, beyond color of skin." Her laugh was bitter. "I was young, naive. What happened? I tended his wounds, fed him, taught him our language so he could speak with our elders." Her pace quickened slightly, as if trying to outrun the memory. "He spoke of peace, of understanding between our peoples. My husband was away hunting with the other men. I believed Ryder's words." Mason could guess the rest. "When he recovered, he returned to his unit." "Yes." The word was sharp as a knife. "2 weeks later, he led soldiers to our village. Used the words I taught him to trick our elders, to get close before they attacked." The familiar weight of shame settled on Mason's shoulders. He had been part of that mission, had offered prayers for its success, had comforted the wounded in dying afterward. Never questioning, never doubting the righteousness of their cause. "I wasn't there for the initial attack," he said quietly. "I remained at the base camp until the fighting was underway." "It does not matter," Ravenwing replied. "You wore the same uniform, served the same purpose." They continued eastward, skirting the base of rising foothills. The terrain grew rockier, dotted with twisted juniper and sage. An owl called somewhere in the darkness, its voice lonely and haunting. "Your husband," Mason said after another long silence. "He fought in the battle?" Ravenwing's steps faltered for the first time. "Silver Wolf, yes. He returned with the hunting party to find our village burning. He led the counterattack." Silver Wolf. The name echoed in Mason's memory, stirring something he couldn't quite grasp. "He was a warrior?" "The bravest of our band," Ravenwing said, pride momentarily overcoming the sorrow in her voice. "His knife bore the crescent moon, the mark of his family for 4 generations." Mason's hand went instinctively to his neck, to the crescent-shaped scar hidden beneath his beard. A cold realization washed over him. The warrior he had killed in self-defense, The one who had nearly taken his life before falling to a lucky blow had been Ravenwing's husband. He stopped walking abruptly, overcome by the terrible coincidence. Ravenwing turned, her expression questioning in the starlight. "What is wrong?" Mason opened his mouth, then closed it again. How could he tell her? How could he admit that he was responsible for her widowhood, for the suffering that had followed? "Nothing," he lied, forcing himself to continue forward. "Thought I heard something." Ravenwing studied him for a moment longer, then resumed walking. But something had changed in her bearing, a new tension, a new awareness, as if she had glimpsed something in his reaction that raised her suspicions. They traveled through the night, stopping only briefly to rest and sip the precious water from Ravenwing's skin. By the time the eastern sky began to lighten with approaching dawn, they had circled wide around the hunter's probable route and were approaching the foothills from a different direction. "The outpost should be in that valley," Mason said, pointing to a narrow gap between two rising slopes ahead. "If memory serves." Ravenwing surveyed the terrain with experienced eyes. "Good position. Defensible." They moved forward cautiously, alert for any sign of the bounty hunters. The valley opened before them, revealing a small stone structure nestled against the base of the northern slope. The abandoned cavalry outpost stood silent in the early light, its walls weathered but intact, partially obscured by the creeping vegetation that had begun to reclaim it. "There," Mason said softly, relief washing through him at the sight. "Solid stone walls. A roof, if it hasn't collapsed. Better than hiding in the open." Ravenwing nodded, though wariness remained in her posture. "The bluecoats built well," she conceded. "But will Ryder not look here? He was a soldier." "It's possible," Mason admitted, "but this post was abandoned years ago, even before the raid on your village. It wasn't on most maps even then." He didn't mention that Ryder, as an officer, might have had access to more detailed charts than the enlisted men. They approached the structure carefully, Mason leading the way with his revolver drawn. The heavy wooden door hung askew on rusted hinges, opening onto a dim interior. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light that penetrated through gaps in the roof. The outpost consisted of a single large room with a small side chamber that had once served as an officer's quarters. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its chimney still intact. "No one's been here in a long while," Mason observed, noting the undisturbed dust on the floor, the cobwebs in the corners. Ravenwing entered cautiously, her eyes taking in every detail, the defensible positions, the exits, the potential threats. Her survival instincts never ceased, even in this moment of relative safety. "It will do," she decided. "For now." They settled in quickly, Ravenwing gathering dry brush for a small fire while Mason cleared space in the main room. The sun rose higher, illuminating the outpost's interior through gaps in the roof, revealing details of its former purpose. A crude wooden table built into one corner, shelves along the walls that had once held supplies, iron hooks for weapons and gear. As Ravenwing built a small fire in the stone hearth, Mason explored the side chamber. It was sparsely furnished with the remains of a wooden bed frame, now little more than rotting lumber, and a small desk beneath a narrow window. On the desk lay a ledger, its pages yellow and brittle with age. Curiosity piqued, Mason carefully opened the book. Inside were duty logs, supply inventories, and patrol reports dating back to 1876. The final entry was dated June 12, 1878, just 2 summers before the raid on Ravenwing's village. He flipped through the pages, scanning the faded handwriting for any mention of Ryder or his unit. About halfway through, a name caught his eye. Lieutenant F. Ryder, 7th Cowboys, requisitioned supplies for special reconnaissance mission. Mason's heart quickened. This outpost had been used as a staging area for Ryder's early scouting operations in Apache territory, the same operations that had eventually led to his wounding and rescue by Ravenwing. A creak of floorboards alerted him to Ravenwing's presence. She stood in the doorway, watching him with those penetrating dark eyes. "What have you found?" she asked. Mason hesitated, then decided on honesty. "Records. This place was used by Ryder's unit before everything happened." She crossed to the desk, looking down at the open ledger. Though she had mentioned learning to read from her father, Mason wasn't sure how well she could decipher the military handwriting and abbreviations. "He was here," she said, more statement than question. "Yes, planning his reconnaissance into your territory." Ravenwing's fingers traced lightly over the page as if connecting physically with the past, the beginning of the path that led to destruction. Mason couldn't argue with that assessment. He closed the ledger gently, raising a small cloud of dust. "We should rest," he suggested. "Take turns keeping watch. The hunters won't likely come this way until they realize they've lost our trail." They returned to the main room where the small fire now burned steadily in the hearth, casting warm light over the stone walls. Ravenwing had arranged her blanket near the fire, leaving space for Mason to share in the warmth if needed. "I will take first watch," she said, settling near the door where she could observe both the interior and, through a narrow gap in the wood, the terrain outside. Mason nodded gratefully, his body suddenly reminding him of its recent ordeal in the desert. He lowered himself onto the blanket, his back against the stone wall, the revolver within easy reach. Despite his exhaustion, sleep proved elusive. His mind kept returning to the revelation of Ryder's survival, to the man's transformation from idealistic officer to ruthless hunter. And beneath that, the growing certainty that the warrior he had killed, the one who had given him the crescent scar, had been Silverwolf, Ravenwing's husband. The weight of this knowledge pressed on him like a physical burden. By what cruel twist of fate had he been rescued by the widow of a man he had killed? And what would happen when Ravenwing discovered the truth? For Mason had no doubt that she would. The connection between his scar and her husband's knife was too specific to remain hidden forever. He must have dozed despite these troubled thoughts, for he awoke suddenly to find the quality of light had changed. The sun was high now, sending sharp beams through the roof gaps. Ravenwing still sat by the door, motionless as a statue, her eyes fixed on the landscape beyond. "Any sign?" Mason asked, his voice rough with sleep. She shook her head without turning. "Nothing yet, but they will come." Mason rose, stretching muscles stiff from resting on the hard ground. He joined her at the door, peering through the narrow opening. The valley lay quiet under the midday sun, no movement disturbing the stillness. "I'll take watch," he offered. "You should rest." Ravenwing hesitated, then nodded. She moved to the blanket, but remained sitting, her back against the wall, eyes still alert despite her evident fatigue. "You do not trust me," Mason observed. A faint, bitter smile touched her lips. "I trust no one. That is why I am still alive. Yet you saved me in the desert. Perhaps that was a mistake." Her gaze was steady, evaluating. Mason couldn't blame her for her suspicion. He was, after all, connected to the very people who had destroyed her life, more directly than she yet knew. "Why does Ryder hunt you so persistently?" he asked, changing the subject. "A bounty alone doesn't explain such dedication." Ravenwing's expression hardened. "He fears what I know, what I might tell." "About the raid?" She nodded slowly. "About how he used my trust, how he promised peace while planning war." Her eyes grew distant. "There was no threat from our village. No raids, no attacks. We lived quietly, away from white settlements." "Then why target your people?" Mason asked, genuinely confused. His understanding had been that the operation was a response to Apache raids on settlements. "Ambition," Ravenwing said simply. "Ryder wanted glory, advancement. A successful campaign against hostiles would give him that." Her voice hardened. "So he created hostiles where none existed." The revelation struck Mason like a physical blow. He had suspected misconduct, perhaps poor judgment. But this was deliberate deception, a betrayal not just of Ravenwing and her people, but of the army itself. "If that's true," he said slowly, "Ryder committed a serious crime under military law." "Who would believe an Apache woman over a white officer?" Ravenwing asked bitterly. Mason had no answer for that. The Army's treatment of native testimony was notoriously dismissive, especially when it contradicted the official narrative. "That's why he hunts you," he realized. "You're a witness to his deception. If you ever reached the military court or even a newspaper, he would lose everything," Ravenwing confirmed. "His reputation, his freedom perhaps." Mason's mind raced with this new understanding. Ryder wasn't just a bounty hunter seeking reward money. He was a man protecting his darkest secret, eliminating the one person who could expose his crimes. The weight of his own complicity pressed down on Mason anew. He had been part of that mission, had offered spiritual comfort to men who were unknowingly participating in a fraud. His prayers had blessed a deception. I need to check outside, he said abruptly, needing air, space to process these revelations. Make sure we haven't been followed. Ravenwing nodded, her penetrating gaze following him as he slipped through the doorway into the harsh sunlight. Outside, Mason circled the small outpost, scanning the surrounding terrain for any sign of the hunters. The valley remained quiet, the only movement the occasional desert bird or the wind stirring through scrub vegetation. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling of impending threat. Ryder was out there, searching, and Mason had no doubt he would eventually find them. As he completed his circuit of the building, Mason's hand went unconsciously to his neck, fingers tracing the crescent scar beneath his beard. The coincidence was too great, the connection too specific. Silver Wolf's knife with its crescent moon emblem, the same distinctive mark now etched permanently into Mason's skin. He leaned against the sun-warmed stone of the outpost, overcome by the weight of his past. How could he tell Ravenwing? How could he admit that he had killed her husband, however unintentionally, however much in self-defense? The fragile trust between them would shatter instantly. Yet the truth would emerge eventually. Secrets had a way of revealing themselves, especially ones as significant as this. And when Ravenwing discovered it on her own, as she inevitably would, her sense of betrayal would only be greater for his silence. Mason pulled out his pocket watch, opening the case to look once more at Margaret's face, at little Thomas on her lap. "What would you have me do?" he whispered to the image, as if his long-dead wife might offer guidance from beyond. The inscription caught the sunlight, "Faith guides through darkness." Words that had once been the foundation of his life, now little more than painful reminders of all he had lost. Faith. It seemed a foreign concept now, after years of anger and bitterness. Yet something stirred in Mason's chest. Not faith rekindled, but perhaps the first acknowledgement that he missed its presence in his life. With a snap, he closed the watch case and returned it to his pocket. Whatever reckoning lay ahead, he would face it. He owed Ravenwing that much at least. Inside the outpost, he found Ravenwing still awake, her back against the wall, eyes watchful. She had added wood to the small fire, which now burned steadily in the stone hearth. "No sign of them," Mason reported, settling across from her. "Not yet." She nodded, unsurprised. "They will come. Ryder does not give up." A silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Mason wrestled with himself, knowing what needed to be said but unable to find the words. Ravenwing's voice cut through his thoughts. "I know the mark on your throat isn't from a horse," she stated flatly, her gaze boring into him. Mason's fingers drifted up, tracing the outline of the scar beneath his beard. After a moment, he nodded. "You're right," he conceded quietly. "I wasn't truthful about that." "Show me." With hesitant movements, Mason tugged his collar aside and combed his beard away, exposing the distinctive wound. The jagged crescent shape stood out pale against his weathered skin, illuminated by the dancing flames. Ravenwing inhaled sharply. She moved toward him with the silent grace of a hunter, kneeling before him to study the mark. Though she didn't touch it, her hands suspended in the air between them, fingers trembling slightly. "The signature of my husband," she whispered, voice barely audible above the crackle of the fire. "Silver Wolf's mark." Mason couldn't read her expression. Shock, grief, anger, all seemed to pass across her features in rapid succession. "You killed my husband." It wasn't a question. "He attacked me during the battle," Mason said quietly. "I was tending wounded men when he came upon us. He was a warrior of great courage." "It happened during the chaos of battle," Mason explained, voice heavy with the weight of memory. "I was kneeling beside a wounded soldier when a shadow fell across us. Your husband, Silver Wolf, appeared as if from nowhere, knife raised. I had no weapon, just my medical kit. We struggled." He paused, swallowing hard. "When it ended, his blade had marked me, and my surgical scissors had found his heart. His eyes, I'll never forget the look in them. Not fear or hatred, but acceptance. The acceptance of a warrior who knew the risk of battle." Ravenwing's eyes snapped to his, searching for mockery or condescension in the praise. Finding none, she sat back on her heels, her gaze never leaving his face. "Did you know?" she demanded. "When I found you in the desert, did you know who I was?" "No," Mason answered truthfully. Not until last night, when you spoke of his knife bearing the crescent moon. Then I began to suspect. Yet you said nothing. Mason spread his hands helplessly. What could I say? That by some twisted chance, the woman who saved my life was the widow of a man I killed in battle? A battle that should never have happened, Ravenwing reminded him, her voice hard. A battle based on Ryder's lies. Yes, Mason agreed quietly. I understand that now. Ravenwing rose and moved away from him, putting distance between them. Her body was tense, coiled like a spring, and Mason wouldn't have been surprised if she had decided to leave then and there. Instead, she turned back to face him, her expression unreadable. Why did you leave the army after the raid? The question caught Mason off guard. Yahamayan. It wasn't immediately after. I continued as chaplain for another year. Then my wife and son died in St. Louis. Fever took them both within a week. And your God could not save them, Ravenwing surmised. I prayed, Mason said, the old bitterness rising in his voice. Day and night, I begged for their lives. Promised anything, everything, if they would be spared. He laughed hollowly. But they died anyway. And I realized all my faith, all my service, meant nothing. Ravenwing watched him steadily, her anger seemingly tempered by his obvious pain. So you abandoned your calling, became a drifter. Yes, I left everything behind. The collar, the church, the prayers that had failed me. Mason ran a hand through his beard, grown long to hide both his identity and the scar. Took work where I could find it, ranch hand, cattle driver, whatever kept me moving. Running from memories, Ravenwing observed. Yes. She moved back to the fire, adding another piece of wood. The flames leapt higher, casting her profile in sharp relief against the stone wall. From the moment I found you, she said suddenly, breaking the long silence, I knew the truth. Mason turned to her, confusion clouding his features. What truth? Her eyes met his, unflinching. That my husband's blade had marked you. That you were the one who ended his life. She gestured toward his neck. Silverwolf carved that symbol into the throats of his enemies, but only those he considered worthy opponents. I recognized it instantly when you lay dying in the sand. A cold shock spread through Mason's chest. All this time, he whispered. You knew, yet you chose to save me? To help me? Ravenwing nodded once, her expression unreadable. Yes. Why? He demanded, unable to comprehend such mercy. Ravenwing's expression softened slightly, something like pity entering her eyes. Because death is easy, holy man. Living with the consequences of our actions. That is the true test of courage. The words struck Mason to his core. Was that what he had been doing these past 5 years? Avoiding the harder path of living with his grief and doubt by burying them beneath anger and drifting? You could have let me die, he said, taken revenge for your husband. Each silver wolf died a warrior's death, facing his enemy, Ravenwing replied. There would be no honor in killing a helpless man in the desert. She paused, then added more quietly, and my father taught me that revenge only continues the cycle of suffering. Mason sat in silence, humbled by her restraint, her wisdom. Despite everything she had endured, the loss of her husband, her exile from her tribe, being hunted like an animal, she had chosen mercy over vengeance. Your father, he said finally, he taught you well. He tried to build bridges between our worlds, Ravenwing said, sadness coloring her voice. But the world was not ready. Outside, the light began to shift as afternoon gave way to evening. Mason rose and moved to the door, checking the valley once more for any sign of pursuers. The landscape remained quiet, bathed in the golden light of approaching sunset. We should consider our next move, he said, returning to the fire. Ryder and his men will eventually find this place. Ravenwing nodded. We cannot stay long. Where will you go after? Mason gestured vaguely, encompassing their current situation. I have cousins to the north, she said, among the Jekarilla. If I can reach them. Mason understood her hesitation. The journey would be dangerous, especially with bounty hunters on her trail, and there was no guarantee her distant relations would welcome her, given her reputation as an outcast. I could help you get there, he offered, surprising himself with the words. Least I could do after killing my husband? Ravenwing finished for him, her directness unwavering. Mason winced but nodded. Yes, and for all the rest, the raid, the Army's actions. I was part of it, even if I didn't know Ryder's deception. Ravenwing studied him for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. Perhaps there is another way, she said finally. A way to end Ryder's hunt once and for all. How long? If others knew what he did, his superiors perhaps, or those newspapers that white people trust so much. Mason considered this. You want to expose him? Make his crimes known? Would your army not punish such actions, using deception to attack peaceful people? They should, Mason said carefully, if there was proof, but it would be your word against his. And as you said yourself, who would believe an Apache woman over a white officer? But they might believe a white officer's written orders, Ravenwing countered, or his own words recorded in that book you found. Mason frowned, turning back toward the side chamber. The ledger? It only showed that he was here planning reconnaissance. It doesn't prove his deception. There may be more, Ravenwing insisted. Ryder was proud of his cleverness. He would have kept records, notes of his plan. With renewed interest, Mason returned to the small desk in the side chamber. The brittle ledger still lay where he had left it, but now he began searching the desk itself more thoroughly. The drawers were empty save for dust and the remnants of old papers too decayed to read. But as he ran his hands along the underside of the desktop, his fingers encountered something unexpected, a small lever or latch. Curious, he pressed it, and a narrow drawer slid out from the front of the desk, concealed by the decorative molding. Inside lay a small, leather-bound journal. Mason's heart quickened as he carefully lifted the book. The cover bore no markings, but inside on the first page was a name written in a familiar hand. Lieutenant Frank Ryder, 7th Cavalry Regiment. Ravenwing, he called, his voice tight with excitement. I found something. She appeared in the doorway as Mason began carefully turning the brittle pages. The journal contained detailed notes on Ryder's reconnaissance missions, maps of Apache territory, and most damning of all, his plans for advancing his career through a decisive action against hostiles. One entry in particular caught Mason's eye. Met again with the Indian woman today. She continues to provide valuable intelligence unwittingly. Her belief in my interest in peace makes her dangerously forthcoming. Have mapped the approach to their village and identified the best time for attack when the warriors will be away hunting. Colonel Matthews has approved the operation based on my reports of hostile activity, reports that, while embellished, will be vindicated by a successful campaign. Mason felt sick as he read the cold calculation with which Ryder had betrayed Ravenwing's trust. The journal continued with detailed plans for the raid, including false reports of Apache attacks to justify the mission. This is it, Mason said, looking up at Ravenwing. Proof of Ryder's deception. His own words. Ravenwing's eyes widened as she understood the significance of their discovery. Will this be enough for your army to punish him? This, combined with testimony. Yes, I believe it would be, Mason said slowly. But we would need to get it to Fort Bowie. That's where the regimental headquarters was located. How far? Mason calculated quickly. 3 days' journey south, through rough country. Ravenwing's face set with determination. Then we go to Fort Bowie. It won't be simple, Mason warned. Ryder and his men are between us and the fort. And even if we reach it, there's no guarantee they'll listen to an Apache woman and a disgraced former chaplain. But they will read his words, Ravenwing countered, pointing to the journal, the truth in his own hand. She was right, Mason realized. The journal itself might be enough to at least launch an investigation, regardless of who delivered it. And if that happened, other witnesses might come forward. Soldiers who had participated in the raid believing they were responding to genuine hostilities. We'll need supplies, he said, beginning to think practically. Food, water, ammunition. I can find water, Ravenwing assured him. Food too, from the desert. But we must move quickly before Ryder finds us here. As if summoned by her words, a sound reached them from outside. The distant but unmistakable rhythm of hoofbeats approaching the valley. Mason moved swiftly to the door, peering through the gap. His heart sank at what he saw. Riders, he confirmed grimly. 5 of them, coming from the north. Ravenwing joined him, her body tense with readiness. Ryder? Mason nodded, recognizing the lead figure even at a distance. They must have realized they lost our trail and circled back to check the outpost. How long? 10 minutes, maybe less. Ravenwing's mind worked quickly. We cannot fight 5 armed men. We must run. Where? Mason asked, gesturing to the open valley that surrounded the outpost. They'll see us the moment we leave cover. Ravenwing moved to the back wall, examining it closely. Here, she said, pointing to a section where the mortar had crumbled, creating a gap between stones. We can widen this. There is brush behind the building, enough to hide our escape if we stay low. Without waiting for a response, she began working at the loose stones, using a piece of wood as a lever to widen the gap. Mason quickly joined her, and together they created an opening large enough to squeeze through. The journal, Mason remembered suddenly, returning to the side chamber to retrieve it. He tucked the precious evidence inside his shirt, then rejoined Ravenwing at the impromptu exit. I'll go first, she said, already slipping through the opening. Stay close to the ground. Mason followed, scraping his shoulders on the rough stone as he pushed through the narrow gap. Outside, they crouched in the shadow of the building, the thick brush providing minimal cover. Which way? He whispered. Ravenwing pointed to a rocky outcropping about 100 yards to the east. There, if we can reach it before they surround the outpost. The unspoken alternative hung in the air between them. If Ryder and his men spotted them crossing the open ground, they would be easy targets. Go, Mason urged. I'll be right behind you. Ravenwing hesitated, searching his face as if to confirm he wouldn't abandon her. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, for she nodded once and began to move, staying low, using every bit of available cover. Mason followed, his heart pounding. The riders were closer now. He could hear the jingle of tack and the low murmur of voices as they approached the outpost from the opposite side. Any moment they would arrive and discover the abandoned building, the still burning fire inside. 50 yards to the outcropping, 40, 30. The brush thin, forcing them to belly crawl across exposed ground. Mason's hand went to his revolver, knowing it would offer little protection against 5 armed men, but determined to buy Ravenwing time to escape if necessary. 20 yards. 10. The rocky shelter was almost within reach when a shout rang out behind them. There! By the rocks! Mason turned to see one of Ryder's men pointing in their direction, already raising his rifle. Without hesitation, Mason pushed Ravenwing forward toward the safety of the outcropping and drew his revolver. The first shot kicked up dust near his feet. The second whined past his ear. Mason fired back, not aiming to hit at this distance, but to slow their pursuers. Ravenwing reached the rocks and turned, her face a mask of determination. Come, she called. Now! Mason fired once more, then sprinted the remaining distance to the outcropping, bullets striking stone around him as he dove into cover beside Ravenwing. This way, she said, already moving deeper into the rocks. There is a path through. Mason followed, trusting her knowledge of terrain. Behind them, Ryder's voice rang out, ordering his men to surround the outcropping. But Ravenwing led them through a narrow defile hidden from view that wound upward into the foothills beyond. They climbed swiftly, using the rocky terrain to their advantage, moving from cover to cover. Below, they could hear the frustration in Ryder's voice as his men lost their trail among the stones. Only when they had put considerable distance between themselves and their pursuers did they pause to catch their breath. The sun hung low in the western sky, casting long shadows across the land. From their elevated position, they could see Ryder and his men still searching the base of the outcropping, unaware that their quarry had already escaped into the higher ground. They will follow, Ravenwing said, her breath coming in short gasps. But night comes soon. Darkness will help us. Mason nodded, leaning against a boulder as he fought to steady his breathing. The journal pressed against his chest, a physical reminder of their purpose, their destination. Fort Bowie, he said, determination hardening his voice. We'll make it. Ryder won't win this time. Ravenwing studied him, something like respect flickering in her dark eyes. Perhaps there is still a holy man inside you, Mason Holbrook, beneath the bitterness and the beard. Mason touched the silver pocket watch in his pocket, feeling its solid weight, a connection to his past, to the man he had once been. Perhaps, he conceded quietly, but first, we survive. Then we seek justice. As the sun sank toward the horizon, they continued their journey southward, higher into the foothills, two unlikely allies bound by a shared purpose. and by the tangled threads of a past neither could escape. Night descended over the foothills, casting the rugged terrain in shadows of silver and black. Mason and Ravenwing moved steadily southward, using the stars as guides, the moon providing just enough light to navigate the treacherous path. Behind them, the occasional flicker of distant torches betrayed riders' continuing pursuit. "He won't give up easily," Mason observed, pausing briefly to catch his breath on a narrow ledge. "Not with what's at stake." Ravenwing nodded, her face grave in the moonlight. "For him, this is survival. If his crimes are exposed, his career, his freedom, everything ends," Mason finished. The leather-bound journal pressed against his chest felt heavier with each mile, its contents a death sentence for riders' ambitions. They continued in silence, conserving breath for the difficult climb. The terrain grew increasingly challenging, loose shale that shifted underfoot, steep inclines that required both hands for balance, narrow passages between towering rock formations. Yet Ravenwing moved with instinctive grace, her knowledge of the land guiding them through shortcuts invisible to untrained eyes. By midnight, they had put considerable distance between themselves and their pursuers. The moon hung high overhead, casting enough light to reveal a small plateau nestled between two higher ridges. A cluster of juniper trees provided shelter from the biting wind that had risen with nightfall. "We can rest here," Ravenwing decided, sinking down beneath the largest juniper. "For a few hours only." Mason joined her gratefully, his muscles aching from the relentless pace. He withdrew his revolver, checking the remaining ammunition. 4 bullets, barely enough if it came to a confrontation. "Here," Ravenwing offered him the waterskin. "Drink sparingly. We won't find water again until we reach the southern arroyos." Mason took a measured sip, then passed it back. "How far to Fort Bowie from here?" Ravenwing's face tightened at the mention of the army outpost. 2 days if we move quickly. Longer if we must hide from Ryder." Mason nodded, calculating their odds. Food wasn't an immediate concern. Ravenwing had demonstrated remarkable skill at finding edible plants and small game during their journey. But water would become critical in the desert heat, and Ryder had horses, giving him a significant advantage in open terrain. "We should avoid the main trails," he said. "Stick to the high ground when possible." "Yes," Ravenwing agreed, "but eventually we must descend. The fort lies in the valley beyond the Dragoon Mountains." The mention of those mountains stirred something in Mason's memory, a detail from his time with the cavalry. "There's a pass," he said slowly, "narrow, difficult for horses, used by Apache raiders to avoid army patrols." Ravenwing's eyes widened slightly. "You know of this place?" "Only by reputation," Mason admitted. "It was spoken of with frustration by the officers. They called it the Ghost Trail because Apache warriors would seem to vanish into thin air when pursued in that area." A ghost of a smile touched Ravenwing's lips. "It exists. My husband's grandfather discovered it generations ago. Few outside the tribe know its location." "Could you find it?" She nodded, confidence in her bearing. "Yes, it would take us directly to the southern approach to Fort Bowie, bypassing the main roads where Ryder might set an ambush." Hope stirred in Mason's chest, the first genuine optimism he'd felt since spotting Ryder among the bounty hunters. If they could reach this secret pass, they might yet deliver the damning evidence and bring justice to Ravenwing's people. "We should move at first light," he suggested. "Use the darkness now for rest." Ravenwing nodded, settling more comfortably against the juniper trunk. Her eyes remained alert, scanning the darkness beyond their small haven. Mason withdrew the damning evidence from its hiding place beneath his shirt. The worn leather cover felt almost alive in his hands, its contents a poison that could destroy Ryder's career and perhaps his life. Despite his exhaustion, Mason found himself drawn to the later entries, carefully turning the yellowed pages until he found the lieutenant's reflections penned after the raid on Ravenwing's village. The words he found chilled him to the bone. "Regrettable about Lieutenant Holbrook. When he began questioning the legitimacy of our intelligence on the hostiles, I had hoped to bring him around to the necessity of our actions. His faith made him naive, too concerned with right and wrong when glory and advancement were within reach. His disappearance after the explosion is perhaps for the best. One fewer witness to question the official account." Mason stared at the passage, stunned. Ryder had considered him a threat, had been relieved at his supposed death. The realization brought a fresh wave of guilt. Had he not been knocked unconscious in that explosion? Might he have discovered Ryder's deception years earlier? Could he have prevented the continued persecution of Ravenwing and her people? He read on. The Apache woman remains at large. Most concerning, as she alone knows the full extent of my methods. The bounty I've arranged through unofficial channels should ensure she is captured or eliminated before she can speak to anyone of influence. Colonel Matthews believes the story that she was an agitator who provided false intelligence to lure our troops into an ambush, a narrative that protects both of us from scrutiny. The depth of Ryder's deception was staggering. Not only had he fabricated threats to justify attacking a peaceful village, but he had then twisted the narrative to blame Ravenwing for his own crimes. What does it say? Mason looked up to find Ravenwing watching him, her dark eyes reflecting pinpricks of starlight. Ryder's account of what happened after the raid, he replied, his voice tight with anger. He feared I might question his actions if I had survived, and he's fabricated a story claiming you deliberately misled the army. Ravenwing's expression didn't change, but Mason noticed her hands clench briefly before relaxing again. He builds lies upon lies, she said quietly, like a spider's web, each strand supporting the others. This will destroy him, Mason said, tapping the journal. His own words, his admissions, written in his hand. No one could deny the evidence. If we reach the fort alive, Ravenwing reminded him, and if someone there will listen. Mason thought of the officers he had known at Fort Bowie, some honorable, others less so. Colonel Matthews is implicated here too, he mused. He may have been complicit or at least willfully ignorant, but there were good men there as well. Captain Ellsworth, for one. He always struck me as a man of principle. You trust this captain? As much as I trust anyone in uniform anymore, Mason replied honestly, which isn't saying much, but he attended services regularly, sought counsel on moral matters. If he's still stationed there, he might be our best chance. Ravenwing considered this, then nodded slowly. When we arrive, we ask for this Ellsworth. No one else. Agreed. They fell silent, each lost in private thoughts. Mason's gaze drifted upward to the vast expanse of stars wheeling overhead. Once he had seen the night sky as evidence of God's majesty and design. Now, after years of doubt and bitterness, he wasn't sure what he saw. Beauty, certainly, but meaning? Purpose? Those remained elusive. Yet something had begun to shift within him during these days with Ravenwing. Witnessing her courage, her resilience in the face of injustice, her choice of mercy over vengeance, despite all she had suffered, it stirred questions he had long suppressed. Perhaps his old faith had been too narrow, too rigid in its certainties. Perhaps there were other ways of understanding the divine than those he had preached from pulpits. You're thinking of Ura, Ravenwing observed, breaking the silence. Mason glanced at her, surprised by her perception. How did you know? A faint smile touched her lips. Your face changes, softens, then hardens again. The struggle is written there. I was thinking about meaning, he admitted. Purpose, things I once took for granted. The stars have purpose, Ravenwing said, gesturing upward. They guide travelers home. The plants have purpose. They feed and heal. The rain has purpose. All things are connected in the great circle. A different kind of faith, Mason mused. Not so different, she countered. Your Bible speaks of one creator. My people believe in one great spirit. Different words, perhaps, but the reverence is the same. The observation startled Mason with its simplicity and insight. How many times had he dismissed native spiritual beliefs as primitive or misguided? Yet here, beneath the same stars, the commonality seemed more apparent than the differences. My wife would have liked you, he said suddenly, the words surprising even himself. Ravenwing tilted her head, waiting for him to continue. Margaret had a way of seeing through pretense, finding the truth beneath, Mason explained. She never accepted easy answers, even from me, especially from me. She would have appreciated your directness. And I would have respected her strength, Ravenwing replied. To marry a holy man requires courage. A soft laugh escaped Mason at this unexpected humor. Yes, I suppose it does. The shared moment lightened the air between them, transforming them briefly from reluctant allies into something approaching friends. But reality intruded as a distant sound reached them, the faint echo of voices carried on the night wind. "Ryder's men," Mason said, instantly alert. "They're in the canyon below." Ravenwing rose in one fluid motion, gathering her few possessions. "We've rested enough. We must move now while darkness still protects us." Mason followed her lead, tucking the journal securely inside his shirt. They set off again, moving higher into the foothills, using the rugged terrain to stay hidden from the hunters below. The night air grew colder as they climbed, but neither complained. Discomfort was a small price for survival. By the time dawn began to lighten the eastern horizon, they had reached a vantage point that afforded a view of the vast territory before them. In the distance, the Dragoon Mountains rose like dark sentinels against the pale sky, their slopes forbidding and steep. "There," Ravenwing said, pointing toward a barely discernible break in the mountain range. "The secret pass lies there between the twin peaks." Mason squinted, trying to make out the features she indicated. At this distance, the mountains appeared solid, unyielding, offering no obvious pathway through. "It's at least a day's journey," he estimated, "across open country." Ravenwing nodded, her expression grave. "The most dangerous part of our path. Ryder will expect us to head south toward the fort. He will have men watching the likely routes. Can we travel by night? Too difficult in that terrain. Too many ravines, too easy to break an ankle or worse." She studied the landscape thoughtfully. "We must find another way to move unseen." Mason scanned the expansive desert that separated them from the mountains, searching for inspiration. His eyes settled on a line of greenery that cut across the otherwise barren plain, a dry riverbed, likely to have at least some vegetation offering cover. "The wash," he suggested, pointing to the distant arroyo. "It's not direct, but it provides some concealment, and it runs roughly in the direction we need." Ravenwing followed his gaze and nodded slowly. "Yes, and there may be water beneath the sand if we dig. A good plan." They began their descent, moving carefully down the rocky slope toward the desert floor. The sun rose higher, bringing with it the punishing heat that had nearly claimed Mason's life days earlier. But now he had water, however limited, and the knowledge of desert plants that Ravenwing had shared. Survival seemed possible, even likely, if they could avoid Ryder and his men. Reaching the arroyo required crossing nearly a mile of open terrain, a dangerous proposition with hunters potentially watching from the hills they had just left. They paused at the base of the foothills, concealed behind a large boulder, to observe the landscape for any sign of pursuit. "No movement," Mason reported after several minutes of careful scanning. "But that doesn't mean they're not out there." Ravenwing studied the ground before them, calculating. "We go separately," she decided. "I first, then you when I reach the halfway point. Moving targets are harder to hit at distance." Mason wanted to object, to insist on going first himself, or to suggest they stay together, but he recognized the wisdom in her plan. Dividing their movement would make it harder for any hidden watchers to target them both. "Be careful," was all he said as Ravenwing prepared to make her run. She gave him a brief, intense look. "If I fall, take the journal and continue. This truth must be known." Before he could respond, she was moving, her slender figure darting across the open ground with remarkable speed and agility. Mason watched, his heart in his throat, revolver ready in his hand, though any shooter would likely be well beyond its effective range. No shots came, no shouts of discovery. Ravenwing reached the halfway point and continued without breaking stride, disappearing into the shallow depression of the arroyo moments later. Mason counted slowly to 60, giving her time to secure the area, then began his own dash across the exposed terrain. The sun beat down on his shoulders as he ran, sweat instantly soaking his shirt. His legs, still not fully recovered from his near death in the desert, began to burn with effort. But fear proved a powerful motivator, driving him forward despite the pain and exhaustion. He was 20 yards from the arroyo when a shot rang out, the bullet kicking up dust several feet to his right. Mason instinctively changed direction, zigzagging as another shot cracked across the desert. He threw himself forward in a desperate dive, tumbling down the shallow bank into the relative safety of the wash. Ravenwing was there instantly, pulling him deeper into cover beneath an overhang of roots and earth. More shots followed, but the bullets struck harmlessly into the opposite bank of the arroyo. "Are you hit?" she asked, her eyes scanning him for injuries. Mason shook his head, fighting to catch his breath. "Missed, but they've found us." "One shooter," Ravenwing said, indicating the direction of the gunfire. "On the ridge we left. The others must be elsewhere." Mason peered cautiously over the edge of the wash. A tiny figure was visible on the distant hillside, too far to identify, but clearly aiming a rifle in their direction. "Too far for accuracy with that rifle," he judged, "but close enough to track our movement, and likely close enough to signal the others." "We must keep moving," Ravenwing urged. "South, along the wash. Stay low." They began to move, crouching below the arroyo's banks, using the vegetation and curves of the dry riverbed for concealment. Occasional shots continued to come from the hillside, but none came close. The distance was simply too great for precision fire with the weapons of the day. The arroyo provided better cover than Mason had dared hope. In places, the banks rose nearly 6 feet, completely shielding them from view. Desert willows and other hardy plants created additional concealment, and as Ravenwing had predicted, digging into the seemingly dry sand occasionally revealed moisture just inches below the surface, enough to replenish their dwindling water supply. They maintained a steady pace throughout the morning, the relentless sun climbing higher, beating down on the desert with merciless intensity. By midday, the heat had become nearly unbearable, forcing them to seek shelter beneath an outcropping where the arroyo bent sharply eastward. "We'll rest through the worst heat," Mason suggested, sinking down gratefully into the shade. "Move again when the sun begins to descend." Ravenwing nodded, conserving energy by limiting unnecessary movement. She produced a small bag of mesquite beans she had gathered along their route, offering some to Mason. The pods were sweet with a slight vanilla flavor, providing welcome nourishment and moisture. As they rested, Mason withdrew the journal once more, turning to the final entries. He wanted to understand fully the man who hunted them with such determination, to know what other secrets might be hidden in these pages. The most recent entry, dated just a month earlier, chilled him anew. Reports of a former Army chaplain matching Holbrook's description in the Pacos region. Unlikely to be him. The man was surely killed in the explosion, but any connection to that time presents a risk. If by some miracle he survived, his knowledge combined with the Apache woman's testimony could prove damaging. "We'll investigate personally while continuing the hunt for the squaw." Mason looked up from the page, stunned. "He knew I might be alive," he said. "He was looking for me even before we encountered each other." Ravenwing's expression darkened. "Two witnesses are more dangerous than one. And now we're together heading for Fort Bowie with his journal in our possession," Mason added grimly. "He must be desperate." "Desperate men are the most dangerous," Ravenwing observed quietly. They fell silent, each contemplating the lengths to which Ryder might go to prevent them from reaching the fort. The stillness of midday settled around them, broken only by the occasional call of a desert bird or the whisper of hot wind across the arroyo. Mason's thoughts drifted to the strange confluence of events that had brought him to this moment. Had his horse not broken its leg? Had Ravenwing not found him dying in the desert? Had they not sought shelter in that particular abandoned outpost? Any deviation in this chain would have resulted in a completely different outcome. Coincidence? Or something more purposeful? His hand went to the pocket watch, feeling its solid weight through the fabric of his shirt. "Faith guides through darkness." The inscription seemed to speak to him now with renewed meaning, though not in the way his grandfather had intended. Perhaps faith wasn't just belief in dogma or doctrine, but something more fundamental. Trust in a larger purpose, even when that purpose remained unclear. "We should move soon," Ravenwing said, breaking into his thoughts. "The mountains are still far." Mason nodded, returning the journal to its place inside his shirt. They gathered their meager possessions and continued southward along the arroyo, maintaining a steady pace despite the lingering heat. As the afternoon progressed, the wash gradually shifted direction, leading them away from their intended route. Eventually, they reached a point where continuing to follow it would take them too far east. "We must leave the arroyo here," Ravenwing decided, studying the terrain ahead. "Cross open ground to reach the mountains before nightfall." Mason surveyed the landscape with concern. Nearly 2 miles of exposed desert separated them from the foothills of the Dragoon Mountains. With the sun beginning its westward descent, they would be silhouetted against the light for any watcher's position to the east. It's a risk, he said, but staying in one place is riskier still. They climbed carefully out of the wash, scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit. The desert stretched empty and silent before them, the mountains a dark promise on the southern horizon. "Ready?" Mason asked, checking his revolver one final time. Ravenwing nodded, her face set with determination. Together they set out across the open terrain, moving as quickly as the rough ground and their exhaustion would allow. They had covered perhaps half the distance when Mason spotted movement to their right. Riders, 3 of them, emerging from behind a distant ridge. "Riders' men," he warned, not breaking stride, "coming from the east." Ravenwing glanced in the direction he indicated, then increased her pace. "They've seen us," she said with certainty. "We must reach the foothills before they intercept us." The race became desperate. Mason and Ravenwing pushed themselves to the limit, ignoring burning muscles and labored breathing, driven by the knowledge that capture meant death, or worse. Behind them, the riders grew steadily larger, closing the distance with the relentless advantage of mounted pursuit. The foothills loomed closer, tantalizingly near, yet still beyond immediate reach. Mason could hear the hoofbeats now, feel the vibration through the ground beneath his feet. His hand closed around the revolver, knowing its 4 remaining bullets would provide little defense against 3 armed men. There, Ravenwing suddenly changed direction, pointing toward a narrow ravine cutting into the first rise of the foothills. "That leads to the path. Horses cannot follow." They made a final desperate sprint toward the ravine entrance. Behind them, a shout rang out, followed by the crack of a rifle. The bullet struck the ground at Mason's feet, sending up a spray of dust and stone. "Go," he urged Ravenwing, falling slightly behind to draw their fire. "I'll cover you." He turned, drawing his revolver, and fired a single shot toward the approaching riders, not aiming to hit at this distance, but forcing them to scatter, to slow their approach. Ravenwing reached the ravine entrance and ducked inside, immediately securing a defensive position behind a large boulder. Mason fired once more, then sprinted the remaining distance to join her. The ravine provided immediate protection, its walls rising steeply on either side, too narrow for horses to navigate comfortably. The riders pulled up at the entrance, unwilling to dismount and follow on foot where they would lose their advantage. "Holbrook!" a voice called out. Ryder's voice, unmistakable even after years. "Throw out the journal and the woman, and you can walk away from this." Mason exchanged a glance with Ravenwing, both recognizing the lie in Ryder's offer. "We know what you did, Frank," Mason called back. "Your own words condemn you. The journal goes to Fort Bowie, with or without us." A stream of profanity was Ryder's only immediate response, followed by urgent instructions to his men. One disappeared back the way they had come, presumably to seek another approach to cut off their escape. "They're trying to flank us," Mason said quietly. "We need to move deeper into the ravine, find the path you mentioned." Ravenwing nodded, already moving further into the narrow passage. "This way. It connects to an old game trail that leads to the pass." They hurried through the deepening shadows of the ravine, the walls rising higher on either side, creating a natural corridor that wound steadily upward into the foothills. Behind them, occasional shouts indicated that Ryder and at least one of his men had dismounted to follow on foot, though their progress would be slower without knowing the terrain. The ravine eventually opened onto a broader slope, dotted with pine and juniper trees, the first real vegetation they had seen since leaving the arroyo. Ravenwing moved confidently along a barely visible path that switched back up the increasingly steep mountainside. "The pass is still hours away," she said as they climbed, "but once we reach it, we will be safe. No horse can navigate it, and on foot, it would be impossible to find without a guide." Mason glanced behind them. The pursuers were not yet visible, but he had no doubt they continued to follow. Ryder had too much at stake to abandon the chase. They climbed steadily as the sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the mountainside. The air grew cooler with elevation, providing welcome relief after the heat of the desert. Mason felt his strength returning somewhat, the mountain air filling his lungs, the clear purpose driving him forward despite exhaustion. As twilight deepened into dusk, they reached a small plateau where the path briefly leveled. A natural spring bubbled from the mountainside, creating a small pool before continuing downward in a slender stream. Ravenwing stopped here, kneeling to drink deeply of the clear water. "We rest for a moment," she said. "This is the last water before the pass." Mason joined her at the spring, the cold water reviving his flagging energy. He refilled their water skin, then scanned the slope below for any sign of pursuit. "I don't see them," he reported, "but they're still coming. Ryder won't give up as long as we have the journal." Ravenwing rose, her expression resolute in the fading light. "Then we continue. We can reach the pass by midnight if we maintain this pace." They set off again, the path growing steeper and more challenging as they ascended. The vegetation thinned, replaced by barren rock and loose scree that shifted treacherously underfoot. In places, the trail narrowed to barely a foot wide, with sheer drops on one side that disappeared into darkness. Night fell completely, the stars emerging once more to guide their way. The moon, a day past full, provided enough light to follow the path, though they moved more slowly to avoid missteps that could prove fatal on the treacherous mountain trail. Mason's thoughts turned to Fort Bowie and what awaited them there. Would Captain Ellsworth still be stationed at the fort? Would he listen to their evidence, or would Ryder's influence have poisoned the minds of the garrison against any testimony from an Apache woman and a disgraced chaplain? These questions occupied him so completely that he nearly missed Ravenwing's sudden stop. She raised a hand for silence, her head tilted in the attitude of intense listening. Then Mason heard it too. Voices carried on the night air. Not from behind as expected, but from above, further along the trail. "The third man," Ravenwing whispered. "He must have circled around, found another path to the higher slopes." Mason's heart sank. They were caught between pursuers, with no easy escape route. The narrow trail offered little opportunity for concealment, and backtracking would lead them directly into Ryder's path. "Options?" he asked quietly. Ravenwing studied the mountainside, her eyes somehow finding details in the darkness that Mason missed entirely. After a moment, she pointed to a narrow ledge that branched off from their current path. "There. It leads to a hunter's cave my people used. Not on any trail a white man would know." Without waiting for a response, she left the main path, carefully picking her way along the nearly invisible ledge. Mason followed, his back pressed against the mountain face, acutely aware of the void that dropped away just inches from his boots. The ledge curved around an outcropping, then widened slightly before ending at a dark opening in the rock face. Ravenwing slipped inside without hesitation. Mason followed, finding himself in a small cave, dry and surprisingly free of the expected musty odor. "We wait here," Ravenwing whispered. "They will pass on the main trail." They settled into the deepest part of the cave where no reflection from the moonlight could betray their presence. Mason's hand rested on his revolver. Only 2 bullets remained, but they might make the difference if discovery came. Time passed with excruciating slowness. Eventually they heard movement outside, the scrape of boots on stone, the low murmur of voices as Ryder's men passed on the main trail. The hunters paused briefly near the cave entrance, apparently consulting on their next move, before continuing upward toward the pass. "They seek to block our route," Ravenwing said after the sounds had faded, "to trap us between them." "Can we reach the pass another way?" Mason asked. Ravenwing considered this, her face thoughtful in the dim light filtering into the cave. "There is an older path, more difficult. Few know of it now. My husband showed me once, years ago. Can you find it in the dark?" "Perhaps. But it requires climbing where no trail exists. It would be dangerous." Mason weighed their options. Remaining hidden in the cave might allow their pursuers to pass completely, but Ryder would almost certainly leave men to watch both sides of the pass. Backtracking risked direct confrontation with Ryder himself. "The older path," he decided. "It's our best chance." Ravenwing nodded, accepting his choice. "We wait 1 hour to ensure they've moved on. Then we go." The hour passed in tense silence. Mason found himself fingering the pocket watch again, its weight a tangible connection to his past. He wondered what his grandfather would think of him now, a fallen man of faith, fleeing killers alongside an Apache woman he once would have considered a heathen. The irony wasn't lost on him. When Ravenwing judged it safe, they slipped out of the cave and back onto the narrow ledge. Instead of returning to the main trail, however, she led him further along the ledge until it seemed to disappear entirely into the sheer face of the mountain. "Here," she said, pointing upward to a series of barely discernible handholds in the rock. "We climb." Mason looked dubiously at the nearly vertical ascent, visible only as slightly darker shadows against the rock face in the moonlight. "You're sure about this?" "No," she admitted frankly, "but it is our only choice now." With that, she began to climb, finding handholds and footholds where Mason saw only smooth stone. He followed, forcing himself to focus only on the next grip, the next step, not on the growing drop beneath them. The climb was harrowing. Several times, Mason's foot slipped or a handhold crumbled beneath his grip, leaving him dangling momentarily before finding new purchase. His arms burned with effort, his fingers growing numb from clutching cold stone. But somehow, they continued upward, Ravenwing leading with seemingly instinctive knowledge of the safest route. After what felt like hours but was likely only 20 minutes of intense climbing, they reached a narrow shelf that cut horizontally across the mountain face. Ravenwing pulled herself onto it, then helped Mason up beside her. "The old path," she said, indicating the shelf that was barely wide enough for single-file travel. "It will take us above the main pass, where we can descend the other side without being seen." They moved carefully along this precarious route, the mountains opening below them in a vista of moonlit slopes and shadowed valleys. Despite the danger, despite the exhaustion, Mason found himself moved by the stark beauty of the landscape, a grandeur that transcended human concerns. The shelf gradually widened as they progressed, eventually becoming a proper trail that wound around the mountain's shoulder. By the time they reached the highest point of their journey, the moon had begun its descent toward the western horizon. Ravenwing stopped at a vantage point that offered a clear view of the lands beyond the Dragoon Mountains. In the far distance, barely visible in the moonlight, lay the lights of Fort Bowie. "There," she said, pointing to the faint glow on the horizon. "We can reach it by tomorrow night if we move quickly." Mason nodded, relief washing through him at the sight of their destination. "And the descent from here? Will we avoid Ryder's men?" "This path joins the main trail beyond the pass," Ravenwing confirmed. "If they are watching the pass itself, they will not see us." They began the descent, moving more easily now on the well-defined trail. The eastern sky gradually lightened with approaching dawn, revealing the rugged beauty of the mountain terrain. Pine trees grew more numerous on this side of the range, offering welcome shade and concealment as they continued downward. By mid-morning, they had reached the foothills on the southern side of the Dragoon Mountains. The fort was still distant, but now clearly visible across the rolling grasslands that surrounded it. Mason felt a strange mixture of emotions at the sight: apprehension at returning to a military installation after so many years, determination to see justice done for Ravenwing's people, and an unexpected sense of coming full circle in his own journey. They paused in the shelter of a small grove to rest and plan their final approach. The open terrain between the mountains and the fort offered little concealment, a deliberate feature of most frontier outposts designed to prevent surprise attacks. "We'll have to cross after nightfall," Mason decided. "Approach the fort under cover of darkness." Ravenwing nodded her agreement, though tension had entered her bearing at the prospect of willingly approaching an army installation. Will they shoot an Apache on sight? It was a legitimate concern. Relations between the military and native tribes remained fraught with violence and mistrust, despite occasional peace treaties and negotiations. "Not if you are with me," Mason assured her, "and we'll approach the main gate openly, not trying to sneak in. I'll ask specifically for Captain Ellsworth." They rested through the remainder of the day, conserving strength for the night's journey and the confrontation that awaited. Mason reviewed the journal one final time, marking specific pages that provided the clearest evidence of Ryder's deception. Ravenwing maintained a watchful vigilance, alert for any sign that Ryder had somehow anticipated their route and positioned men to intercept them. But no pursuers appeared. Perhaps Ryder remained focused on the main pass, believing they were trapped in the mountains. Or perhaps he had abandoned the chase, thinking them lost in the treacherous terrain. Either way, their unexpected route seemed to have granted them a precious advantage. As dusk settled over the land, they prepared for the final leg of their journey. Ravenwing braided her hair tightly, adjusted her deerskin dress as best she could. Mason attempted to tame his wild beard to present at least some semblance of the officer he had once been. "Ready?" he asked as the last light faded from the western sky. Ravenwing met his gaze steadily. "I have waited years for justice," she said simply. "I am ready." They set out across the open grassland, moving at a steady pace through the gathering darkness. The lights of Fort Bowie grew gradually larger, more distinct. Occasionally, the silhouette of a sentry could be seen moving along the wooden palisade that surrounded the installation. When they were perhaps half a mile from the fort, a sound froze them in their tracks. Hoofbeats approaching rapidly from their left flank. "Riders," Mason hissed, pulling Ravenwing towards a shallow depression in the ground. "Take cover!" They dropped flat, pressing themselves into the earth as the riders drew nearer. Through the tall grass, Mason could make out three mounted figures moving at a gallop toward the fort. Even in the poor light, he recognized the lead rider's posture. "Rider," he whispered. "Somehow he got ahead of us." Ravenwing's expression hardened. "He goes to warn the fort, to poison them against us before we arrive." Mason's mind raced. If Ryder reached the fort first, he could create a narrative that would make their evidence suspect. He might even convince the commanding officer to arrest or shoot them on sight. "We need to change our approach," he decided quickly. "Do you know of any sympathetic settlers nearby? Anyone who might help us?" Ravenwing considered briefly, then nodded. "There is a trading post 3 miles east. The owner, McAllister, trades fairly with my people. He might listen." "Can you find it in the dark?" "Yes." "Then that's where we go," Mason said, already adjusting their course. "We'll get McAllister to take a message to Captain Ellsworth, or better yet, bring the captain to meet us there." They set off eastward, staying low in the grass until Ryder and his men had passed completely. The trading post Ravenwing mentioned wasn't visible from their position, but she navigated with confidence, using the stars and her knowledge of the terrain to guide them. After an hour of careful travel, a single light appeared in the distance, a lantern burning in the window of a small wooden structure set apart from other settlements. As they drew closer, Mason could make out the details: a sturdy trading post with attached living quarters, a small corral for horses, and a well-maintained wagon beneath a simple shelter. They approached cautiously, alert for any sign that Ryder might have anticipated this move, and positioned men to watch the post. But the area appeared quiet, with only a thin curl of smoke rising from the chimney to indicate occupancy. "Wait here," Mason instructed, handing Ravenwing the precious journal. "If anything happens, take this and run. Find another way to get it to the authorities." She accepted the journal with a solemn nod, concealing herself in the shadows at the edge of the clearing while Mason approached the trading post alone. He knocked firmly on the door, aware that frontier traders were typically well-armed and suspicious of nighttime visitors. After a moment, a gruff voice called out from within. "Who's there? State your business, or be on your way." "My name is Mason Holbrook," he replied clearly. "Former chaplain with the 7th Cavalry. I need your help, Mr. McAllister." A pause, then the sound of a bolt being drawn back. The door opened partially, revealing a weathered man in his 50s holding a shotgun at the ready. "Don't know any Chaplain Holbrook," McAllister said warily, "and it's mighty late for social calls." "I served at Fort Bowie years ago," Mason explained quickly. "I have evidence of a serious crime committed against the Apache people, a peaceful village attacked under false pretenses. I need to get this information to Captain Ellsworth at the fort." McAllister's expression remained skeptical. "And why come to me instead of riding straight to the fort?" "Because Lieutenant Ryder, the man responsible for these crimes, has just reached the fort ahead of us. He'll try to discredit our evidence or worse, have us shot before we can present it." "Us?" McAllister's eyes narrowed. "Who's with you?" Mason hesitated, then decided on complete honesty. "A woman named Ravenwing. She was the widow of a warrior killed in Ryder's raid. She saved my life in the desert, and we've been hunted by Ryder's bounty hunters for days." To Mason's surprise, recognition flickered in McAllister's eyes at the mention of Ravenwing's name. "The Apache woman with the trading sense," he said, lowering his shotgun slightly. "Speaks good English. Brings in quality hides. You know her?" McAllister nodded slowly. "She trades here sometimes. Keeps to herself, but she's always been fair. Unlike some." He seemed to come to a decision, opening the door wider. "Come in, both of you. We'll talk inside." Mason signaled to Ravenwing, who emerged cautiously from the shadows. McAllister's eyebrows rose slightly at her appearance. Her deerskin dress torn and dusty from their journey, her expression guarded. But he nodded a greeting and stepped aside to allow them entry. The interior of the trading post was simply furnished but clean, with merchandise neatly arranged on shelves and a small living area set up near the hearth. McAllister gestured for them to sit at a rough-hewn table while he put on water for coffee. "Now," he said, settling across from them, "tell me what this is about. All of it." Mason produced Ryder's journal, placing it carefully on the table. This contains Lieutenant Ryder's own account of how he deceived the Army to authorize an attack on a peaceful Apache village. He fabricated reports of hostile activity to advance his career. McAllister listened with growing concern as Mason outlined the events. Ryder's manipulation of intelligence, his betrayal of Ravenwing's trust, the subsequent bounty placed on her to silence a potential witness. Ravenwing added her own testimony, speaking of the peaceful nature of her village before the attack and Ryder's false promises of friendship. When they finished, McAllister sat back, his weathered face grave. "I've heard rumors over the years," he admitted. "Things that didn't add up about that campaign, but nothing this clear." He tapped the journal with one finger. "This is dangerous information, especially to the man it condemns. That's why we need to get it to Captain Ellsworth," Mason pressed. "He was a man of integrity, someone who would take this evidence seriously." "Ellsworth's still at the fort," McAllister confirmed. "Been promoted to major now. Still attends services regular. Still speaks up when he sees something ain't right." He considered for a moment, then nodded decisively. "I'll get word to him. Ask him to come here before first light." Relief washed through Mason. "Thank you." McAllister rose, moving to a small desk where he quickly penned a note. "My son will take this," he explained. "He can use the back trails, avoid the main gate where Ryder might have posted men." A young man emerged from the back room at McAllister's call, accepting the sealed note with a nod before slipping out into the night. Mason watched him go, hope mingling with anxiety. So much depended now on Ellsworth's response, his willingness to meet them, to examine the evidence, to take action against a fellow officer. "You both look half dead on your feet," McAllister observed. "There's a storeroom in back with some blankets. Get some rest while you can. I'll keep watch." Mason wanted to object, to insist on maintaining vigilance himself, but exhaustion was indeed taking its toll. He glanced at Ravenwing, noting the dark circles beneath her eyes, the way she held herself upright through sheer force of will. "A few hours," he agreed reluctantly. "Wake us if anything changes." The storeroom was small but clean, with crates of supplies neatly stacked against the walls. McAllister provided blankets and a lantern, then left them to their rest. Mason sank down gratefully against a wall, every muscle aching from their ordeal. Ravenwing settled nearby, her posture still alert despite her evident fatigue. "We are close now," she said quietly. "Justice is within reach." Mason nodded, wishing he shared her certainty. "If Ellsworth comes, if he believes us, if he has the authority to act on the evidence." "You doubt still," she observed. "Even now." "Not doubt," Mason clarified. "Caution. Ryder has influence, connections, and the Army protects its own." "Not all men are like Ryder," Ravenwing countered. "Your Major Ellsworth, you believe in his honor, or we would not be here." She was right, Mason realized. Despite his disillusionment with the Army, with faith, with institutions in general, he still believed in the integrity of individuals like Ellsworth. Perhaps that was its own kind of faith, not in dogma or doctrine, but in the capacity for goodness that existed in some people, even in corrupt systems. "Rest," Ravenwing urged, seeing his inner conflict. "Tomorrow brings either justice or more struggle. Either way, we will need strength." Mason nodded, stretching out on the blanket, the journal secure beneath his shirt. As exhaustion pulled him towards sleep, his hand found the pocket watch, its weight familiar and somehow comforting. "Faith guides through darkness." The words seemed to whisper through his mind as consciousness faded. But it wasn't his grandfather's voice he heard speaking them. It was Margaret's. Mason awakened to hushed voices in the main room of the trading post. The gray light of pre-dawn filtered through the small window, casting long shadows across the storeroom floor. Beside him, Ravenwing was already alert, her posture tense as she listened to the conversation beyond the door. "That's Ellsworth," Mason whispered, recognizing the measured cadence of the Major's speech. Ravenwing nodded, her face betraying nothing of her thoughts. They had come so far, risked so much, and now the moment of truth was at hand. McAllister appeared in the doorway. "He's here," the trader confirmed, "alone as requested." They found Major Ellsworth standing by the hearth, A tall figure in a pristine uniform, his posture as rigid as Mason remembered. The years had added silver to his temples and lines around his eyes, but his gaze remained sharp and assessing as it swept over the unlikely pair before him. "Chaplain Holbrook," Ellsworth said, surprise evident in his voice. "I thought you were dead." "Many did," Mason replied, stepping forward to offer his hand. "It's just Mason now, Major." Ellsworth clasped his hand firmly. "It's been a long time." His gaze shifted to Ravenwing, who stood slightly behind Mason, her expression guarded. "And this is—" "Ravenwing," Mason said. "She saved my life in the desert, and she's the reason we've come to you." As succinctly as possible, Mason outlined their journey and discovery, placing Ryder's journal on the table between them. Ellsworth listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly grave. "These are serious allegations, Holbrook," he said when Mason finished. Rather, Captain Ryder now, is a decorated officer with an exemplary record. "Read his own words," Mason urged, pushing the journal toward him. "He documents everything, the deception, the false reports, the bounty on Ravenwing." Ellsworth picked up the journal with the care of a man handling evidence. He thumbed through it, pausing to read key passages Mason had marked. His face hardened as he progressed. "I always had questions about that operation," he admitted finally. "The intelligence seemed thin, the urgency manufactured. But I never imagined—" He closed the journal with a snap. "Where is Ryder now?" "At the fort," McAllister interjected. "Arrived last night with 2 men. He knows we're coming," Mason added. "He'll try to discredit us, or worse." Ellsworth nodded slowly, decision forming in his eyes. "I need to take this to Colonel Harris immediately. Ryder needs to be confined pending investigation." He looked directly at Ravenwing. "I'll need your testimony, madam. It won't be easy. Many will not want to hear it." Ravenwing met his gaze unflinchingly. "I have waited years to speak truth to your people. I am ready." "And you, Holbrook, will you testify as well?" Mason hesitated only briefly. "Yes, it's time I stopped running from my past." Ellsworth nodded approvingly. "I'll arrange for an escort back to the fort. You'll be under my personal protection." He picked up the journal. "This evidence will be secured in my quarters until the hearing." 3 days later, Mason stood in the commander's office at Fort Bowie, watching as Colonel Harris questioned Frank Ryder. The captain's facade of confidence had crumbled as the evidence mounted against him. The journal, Mason's testimony, Ravenwing's account, and finally statements from 2 soldiers who had participated in the raid and now admitted their doubts about the mission's justification. "Captain Ryder," Colonel Harris said, his voice cutting like steel, "you are hereby relieved of duty pending court-martial for falsification of intelligence, conduct unbecoming an officer, and the unlawful targeting of peaceful non-combatants." Ryder's face contorted with rage. "You're taking the word of a savage and a defrocked chaplain over a decorated officer?" he snarled. "We're taking the evidence where it leads us," Ellsworth replied coolly. "Your own words condemn you, Captain." As Ryder was led away under guard, Mason caught Ravenwing's eye across the room. Something passed between them. Not triumph, but a quiet acknowledgement of justice long delayed. Later they stood together on the parade ground, watching the sunset paint the desert gold and crimson. "What will you do now?" Mason asked. Ravenwing considered the question. "My cousins among the Jicarilla have offered me a place. Perhaps in time, others from my village will join me there." She turned to him. "And you, holy man?" Mason smiled at the name she still used for him. "I'm not sure. I can't go back to what I was." He touched the pocket watch, a habit now more comfort than pain. "But perhaps I can find a new purpose." At the trading post, Ravenwing suggested, McAllister spoke of needing help, of building a place where White and Apache might trade fairly. Mason nodded slowly. A place between worlds. He considered the idea. It would be a start. The following morning, as they prepared to part ways at the fort gates, Ravenwing reached into her dress and withdrew a small object wrapped in soft leather. She placed it in Mason's palm. "What is this?" he asked, unwrapping it to reveal a small, crescent-shaped medallion carved from antler. "Silver Wolf's symbol," she explained. "Not the knife that marked you, but the meaning behind it. Our people believe such symbols carry power, not to harm, but to protect." Mason closed his fingers around it, feeling its smooth contours. Thank you. You carry two symbols now, she observed, nodding toward the pocket watch visible in his vest. One from your people's faith, one from mine. Faith guides through darkness, Mason murmured, recalling the inscription. Ravenwing smiled slightly. Different words, same truth. As they went their separate ways, Ravenwing north with a small military escort to ensure her safe passage to the Jicarilla, Mason east toward McAllister's trading post. He felt the weight of both symbols against his chest. The pocket watch of his ancestors and the crescent token of Silver Wolf. For the first time in 5 years, Mason Holbrook offered a prayer, not the rigid, formal invocations of his chaplain days, but something simpler, more essential. A prayer of gratitude for survival, for justice, for the chance to begin again. And somewhere in the vast desert sky, he imagined Margaret smiling down at him, whispering once more the words that had guided him home. Faith guides through darkness.